Breaking tonight from Washington, Trump just threatened Canada's most strategic agricultural export. But instead of panic in Ottawa, Mark Carney's response reveals exactly why desperation looks different than strategy. Because what happened in the cabinet room this Monday didn't weaken Canada, it exposed America's deepest vulnerability. Everyone's asking the same question tonight. When Trump announced very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, did he strengthen American farmers or hand Mark Carney the leverage of a generation? The answer will shock you. Washington, Monday afternoon. Trump sits surrounded by Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. They're announcing a $12 billion bailout package for American farmers. Farmers struggling under the weight of Trump's own tariff war. The irony isn't subtle. A lot of it does come in from Canada, Trump declares, referring to fertilizer. And so we'll end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to, because that's the way you want to bolster here. Translation: American farmers can't afford the inputs they need because of my tariffs, so I'm threatening more tariffs on the inputs they need while giving them borrowed money to cope with tariffs I already imposed. You can't make this up. But here's what Trump doesn't mention in that cabinet room. Here's what his advisors either don't understand or won't tell him. Saskatchewan potash isn't just another commodity Canada exports. It's strategic infrastructure. It's the foundation of American agricultural productivity. And Mark Carney knows it. Dear viewers, let me walk you through the arithmetic that should terrify Washington tonight. Over 90% of Canadian fertilizer production gets exported. More than half of those exports, over 50%, flow directly into American farmland. Saskatchewan potash specifically, the potassium that keeps American soil productive, that maintains the yields American farmers depend on, that's almost entirely Canadian. American farmers don't use Canadian fertilizer because they're being nice to Canada. They use it because their soil chemistry demands it, because their crop yields require it, because decades of agricultural planning built American farming around Saskatchewan potash availability. Trump threatening very severe tariffs on this product isn't negotiating leverage. It's agricultural self-sabotage with a press conference. Remember what happened earlier this year? Trump imposed his blanket 25% tariff on Canadian goods. Within weeks, Republican senators from farming states, Chuck Grassley from Iowa leading the charge, forced him to lower fertilizer tariffs to 10%. Not because they love Canada, because their farmers were calling their offices in panic. That 10% rate only applies to quantities exceeding customer limits. Everything within the agreement flows tariff-free. Trump already learned this lesson once. Tonight, he's threatening to learn it again more expensively. But something changed between that first tariff threat and this cabinet room announcement. Mark Carney entered the conversation. And Carney, unlike Trump, understands that agricultural leverage isn't about threats. It's about alternatives. While Trump holds press conferences threatening Canada, while he promises American farmers borrowed billions to cope with his own policies, Mark Carney has been holding different conversations, quiet conversations, strategic conversations, with European agricultural ministers discussing potash partnerships, with Asian markets exploring fertilizer infrastructure, with global buyers recognizing that supply chain reliability matters more than proximity when your supplier's government threatens very severe tariffs every other month. Trump thinks he's leveraging Canada's dependence on American markets. What he's actually doing is advertising to every other potash buyer on earth that Canadian supply needs diversification, that Ottawa has strong reasons to reduce American market concentration, that Mark Carney would be strategically justified in building alternative export channels. The translation Trump won't hear until it's too late. You're not threatening us into compliance, you're pushing us toward independence. Pay attention to what happened recently with Nutrien, Saskatchewan's potash giant. They announced plans for a new export facility, not in British Columbia where Canadian infrastructure would benefit. In Washington state, Canadian politicians reacted with anger. Doug Ford suggested blocking potash exports as retaliation. Scott Moe pushed back, defending free trade principles. The headlines wrote it as Canadian political division. But look deeper. Look at what Nutrien's decision actually signals. A Canadian company investing in American infrastructure to serve global markets because they're reading the same geopolitical climate everyone else sees. Uncertainty, tariff threats, supply chain instability, the need for export route redundancy. Trump sees that facility as Nutrien capitulating to American pressure. What it actually represents is Canadian industry preparing for the day when American market access becomes too unreliable to depend on exclusively. When Carney's diversification strategy becomes operational necessity, not just political positioning, let's examine this bailout package Trump announced, $11 billion for row crop farmers distributed by February 28th. Another $1 billion held back for fruits, vegetables, other crops, while they finalize details. Treasury Secretary Bessent called these payments a liquidity bridge during a period of adjustment. Translation: your costs are skyrocketing because of our tariffs, so we're borrowing money from your grandchildren to help you survive policies we insist are brilliant. Agriculture Secretary Rollins promised her department would work on reshoring fertilizer production, while simultaneously telling manufacturers to lower prices. As if you can threaten an industry with competition and demand they cut their margins at the same time. This isn't economic strategy. This is desperation theater dressed up as strength. And Mark Carney, sitting in Ottawa watching this cabinet room performance, he's calculating something entirely different. He's measuring how many months of tariff chaos American farmers can endure before Republican senators force another Trump reversal. He's estimating how much global market share Canadian fertilizer can capture while America debates reshoring industries that take decades to build. Trump's team promises to reshore fertilizer production. Let's be specific about what that actually means. Saskatchewan's potash deposits represent some of the world's richest, most accessible reserves. Extracting potash requires massive capital investment, specialized mining infrastructure, processing facilities, transportation networks, decades of geological expertise. Canada's been building this industry for generations. America can't replicate that infrastructure in months or years or even a presidential term. The geology doesn't exist in the same concentrations. The investment required would dwarf any subsidies Congress would approve. The timeline extends beyond any electoral cycle. Trump threatening Canadian fertilizer tariffs while promising American fertilizer independence is like threatening Canadian lumber tariffs while promising to grow American forests faster. The economics don't bend to political rhetoric. But here's what does happen during that reshoring fantasy period. American farmers pay higher input costs. Canadian exporters diversify their customer base. Global agricultural markets adjust to recognize that U.S. supply chains carry political risk premiums. And Mark Carney accumulates exactly the kind of economic leverage that doesn't require press conferences to be effective. Dear viewers, between now and the next American election cycle, something extraordinary is going to happen in North American agricultural relationships. Trump pushed too hard, American farmers are paying the price, and Canada, patient, strategic Canada, is going to emerge from this trade war with exactly what Mark Carney's been building toward. Economic sovereignty that doesn't depend on American goodwill. This isn't about one fertilizer threat. This is about the fundamental transformation of Canadian economic strategy, from continental integration to global diversification, from assuming American market access to building alternatives, from viewing Trump's chaos as crisis to recognizing it as opportunity. Every conversation Carney has with European trade officials, every negotiation with Asian agricultural ministers, every infrastructure investment that reduces Canadian dependence on American market access, it all accelerates during moments like Trump's cabinet room performance. Because Trump just reminded every Canadian policymaker why betting your economy on American stability is strategic malpractice. Why building alternative relationships isn't antagonism, it's necessity. Why Mark Carney's pivot from reliance to resilience isn't just campaign rhetoric, it's the only rational response to a partner who threatens your strategic industries on Monday afternoons, between golf outings. Fertilizer isn't unique, it's representative. Trump threatens Canadian steel, aluminum, softwood lumber, dairy, auto parts, now fertilizer. Each threat follows the same pattern. Dramatic announcement. Industry panic. Republican senators from affected states force retreat. Temporary relief. Repeat cycle. What changes each iteration isn't Trump's behavior, it's Canadian strategy. With every threat cycle, Carney's argument for diversification strengthens. With every tariff announcement, Canadian business leaders recognize that American market dependence carries risks they can't manage. With every cabinet room performance, the case for building economic relationships that don't require navigating Trump's mood swings becomes overwhelming. Trump thinks he's leveraging Canada's need for American markets. What he's actually doing is financing Mark Carney's campaign message with evidence that writes itself. Pay attention to that February 28th deadline for farmer payments. That's not arbitrary timing. That's the Trump administration recognizing that American farmers need immediate relief, that planting season decisions happen soon, that this $12 billion isn't generosity, it's preventing agricultural crisis. Crisis caused by Trump's own policies. Now imagine you're Mark Carney, watching this deadline approach, watching American farmers depend on bailout checks to cope with tariff costs, watching Trump threaten more tariffs on inputs those farmers need, watching the whole chaotic cycle repeat. You don't need to threaten anything. You don't need dramatic press conferences. You just need to quietly build alternative export relationships, diversify Canada's customer base, and wait for American farmers to recognize that their real problem isn't Canadian fertilizer prices, it's American trade policy instability. The most powerful leverage never gets announced in cabinet rooms. It's Saskatchewan premiers meeting with global agricultural delegations. It's Canadian trade officials exploring Asian infrastructure partnerships. It's fertilizer companies calculating export route alternatives. It's quiet, strategic, patient work that accumulates advantage without requiring headlines. Trump's style is threats and announcements. Carney's style is preparation and alternatives. Trump measures power by how much he can threaten. Carney measures it by how many options he has when threats arrive. Guess which approach works better in extended trade conflicts? Here's what Washington should be asking tonight, but won't. When Mark Carney becomes prime minister, not if, but when. What does Canadian fertilizer policy look like after 2 years of Trump threatening very severe tariffs? Does Canada maintain current export levels to American markets that treated them as expendable? Or does Canada prioritize relationships with partners who didn't spend years threatening their strategic industries? Does Saskatchewan potash flow primarily to customers who recognized its value, or to customers who assumed they could always threaten their way to better terms? Trump's creating the conditions for his own worst outcome. He's teaching Canada that American market access isn't reliable, that diversification isn't optional, that Mark Carney's sovereignty agenda isn't radical, it's responsive. You want to know what shocked me about Trump's cabinet room statement? Not the threat itself. We've seen these threats before. What shocked me was the complete absence of awareness about what he's actually accomplishing. He thinks he's strengthening American agriculture. He's actually fragmenting North American supply chains. He thinks he's leveraging Canadian dependence. He's actually accelerating Canadian independence. He thinks he's reshoring strategic industries. He's actually advertising to the world that American partnerships carry risks nobody needs to accept. And Mark Carney, watching from Ottawa, he doesn't need to respond publicly. He just needs to continue building the alternative relationships, the diversified markets, the economic sovereignty that makes Trump's threats increasingly irrelevant. Between now and Canada's next election, probably within 18 months, watch for these patterns. Canadian agricultural exports to Asia increasing, European partnerships and potash infrastructure deepening, global fertilizer contracts emphasizing supply stability clauses. Quiet but measurable shifts in where Canadian strategic resources flow, not because of dramatic policy announcements, not because Carney will threaten American farmers, but because businesses, farmers, and trading partners worldwide will recognize that building relationships with stable, reliable partners beats navigating Trump's tariff theater. And American farmers, the ones Trump claims he's helping with this $12 billion bailout, they'll be calling their senators again, explaining that they need Canadian fertilizer, that very severe tariffs don't help them plant crops, that presidential threats don't substitute for agricultural inputs. Chuck Grassley will be fielding those calls again. Republican senators from farming states will be pressuring the White House again, and Trump will either retreat again or watch American agricultural productivity decline while Canadian exporters serve different markets. Dear viewers, what you witnessed in that cabinet room wasn't strength. It was the sound of leverage evaporating in real time. Trump threatening industries he depends on, promising reshoring that won't happen, offering bailouts that don't solve the underlying chaos his policies create. Mark Carney doesn't need to match that theater. He just needs to be everything Trump isn't. Patient instead of impulsive. Strategic instead of reactive. Focused on building alternatives instead of threatening partners. Trump's fertilizer threat didn't weaken Canada. It reminded Canada exactly why economic sovereignty matters. Why dependence on American goodwill is strategic vulnerability. Why Mark Carney's vision of Canadian resilience isn't just campaign messaging. It's survival strategy. The shock isn't that Trump made this threat. The shock is that he still doesn't understand he's not threatening Canada into compliance. He's pushing Canada toward independence. And when that transformation completes, when Canadian strategic resources flow primarily to partners who valued them, Trump will hold another press conference explaining why it's everyone else's fault. But Saskatchewan Potash will be fertilizing Asian farmland. European partnerships will be operational, and Mark Carney will be explaining to Canadians how they built economic sovereignty while Trump was busy making threats he couldn't enforce. That's not the future Trump promised his farmers, but it's the future his chaos is creating. And Canada, patient, strategic Canada, is ready.